example I would like to go through is looking at the creation of the world. So we know that God gives us information about the creation of the world through Holy Scripture, through the Bible. And the first chapter of the Bible is Genesis 1. And we read in there, in Genesis 1, that it takes 6 days from the moment that God starts to create to get to the moment where we have human beings. But that seems to be at odds with what we have with regards to what we're seeing in science. When we study the universe, it seems as if there have been billions of years between the moment that the universe started to exist to having human beings. And so there appears to be a conflict here. There appears to be a discrepancy. And so how do we resolve that? What do we do with that? We need to go deeper and try to understand how to approach it. Now, whenever we look at Scripture, it's always important for us to keep in mind two principles. One, the historical, and two, the theological. With regards to the historical, we believe that God inspired human authors to write down certain pieces of information. But those authors, when they write these things, they're doing it in their specific time period, in a specific place, within a specific culture, using a specific language that includes all kinds of idioms, metaphors, and the language itself has its own variety of meanings for the different words. And so, when it comes to Genesis 1, we have to keep all of that in mind when we try to understand what is the intention of the author. What is the author of Genesis 1 trying to tell us? And if we look at the structure of Genesis 1, what we would discover, provided we're familiar with ancient Hebrew poetry, is that it's an ancient Hebrew poem. And the structure is consistent with that of other ancient Hebrew poems that are written. And in this structure of poetry, the first 3 days have a theme of separation, where God is separating different things in order to create them and make distinctions. But in the last 3 days of the 6, there's a theme of population. Now that we have these regions, these areas of creation, God then populates them. But we also see a connection between the days in the first set and the second set. So day 1 and day 4 are both talking about light. And day 2 and day 5 are both talking about water. And day 3 and day 6 are both talking about things regarding land. And so we see that this is structure of Hebrew poetry. Now, whenever we think of poetry, are we looking for detailed historical information? Are we really looking for a scientific analysis of something? Typically not when it comes to poetry. And so we shouldn't treat it like that. We shouldn't treat it as if it was something that has that kind of information, because that's not what it is, and that's not what it's for. But it's also important to look at the language itself. And in the ancient Hebrew language, the word that they use for day is yom, which could mean a 24-hour period, but it could also mean a longer period of time, or simply a period of time. And so within the language itself, what they used for day doesn't necessarily mean a 24-hour period. Also, whenever we go through Scripture and try to understand what the Scriptures say and how we are to interpret them, we don't just look at Scripture alone. We also look at what did the early Christians believe? How did they understand these Scripture passages? And we also look to the church. What did the church teach? Definitively teach about these passages, things that we should and need to know. And so if we go as far back as the 5th century, and we look at what did the theologians say about Genesis 1 at that time, they knew, some of them would promote and suggest that this is not intended to be a scientific document. Likewise, in the 19th century, Pope Leo XIII made a similar comment, saying that this isn't intended to be a scientific explanation of how God created the universe.